The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A., and my guest this evening is Craig James. Craig James started his professional career as a Cabrillo College dropout. At the age of 17, 4 years as a sailing instructor, boat builder, machinist, and carpenter taught him the value of craftsmanship and what it means to have real responsibilities. He also figured out that laboring in the hot sun can make college seem quite attractive. Born and raised in California, he graduated from UC Davis with a degree in electrical engineering and some years later earned his master's degree in computer science from Stanford University. It was while at Stanford studying artificial intelligence, linguistics, and philosophy that James got his first inspiration to write a book. In addition to his writing, James is an accomplished amateur guitarist, a tolerable clarinet player, a deep-sea sailor, and the father of three. In his spare time, he enjoys sailing, hiking, and bicycling in the beautiful beaches and mountains of Northern California. Craig James, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I want to start off our conversation with your book, The Religion Virus, and later we'll get a chance to hear about your new novel, Affairs of State. You start off The Religion Virus talking about the 4,000-year marketing makeover of God. So I wondered, just to introduce the subject, if you could talk about how, particularly in the major monotheistic religions of the world, the conception of God has changed.
Well, that's a great question. In fact, it was one of the very things that led me to write the book in the first place, was looking at all of what seemed to be inconsistencies in the Bible and in people's understanding of who God is and that sort of thing. And so I got to thinking about what is it that makes all these inconsistencies? And if you look at them all in the present day and say God has to be all of these things, it doesn't make any sense. He can't be a guy who drowns the whole world and also who's this loving, caring guy who's our father figure and stuff like that. But if you look at it from a historical perspective and go back to what people believed, 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 4,000 years ago, it's an entirely different story. For example, if you go back say 2,000 years before Christ, the Jews or the Israelites, they weren't calling themselves Jews at that time, they were not monotheistic, they were polytheistic. And in fact, you can see this in lots of passages in the Bible where they talk about how God has to make a covenant with the Jews to protect them. Well, why would he have to make a covenant if he was the only God? And they knew this and they believed it. And so when they made this deal, it was a pretty big deal because they agreed not to worship the other gods that they believed in. And if you go forward in time, you find that God became more and more powerful. He was originally just a god of armies, and he became a god of everything by our day. He was originally only in the original place where the Israelites lived. They were actually worried when they were driven out of their land that he wouldn't be able to hear their prayers. And so he became more globalized. He became able to answer more prayers. He became kinder and gentler and that sort of thing. And over the course of 4,000 years, he evolved century by century, person by person, into the God that we think of today, who is not only, just in this little valley in Israel somewhere, but he actually created the entire universe. And that was not what they believed, thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. And if you look at religions in general, you'll see this broad trend that starts with what we call animistic beliefs, where I don't like to use the word primitive because it's kind of judgmental, but people, a long time ago, they were animistic. They had spirits and they believed, in deer gods and bear gods and rain gods and things like that. And over the centuries and millennia, these tend to evolve into larger and more capable spirits and gods and into a hierarchy of gods and that sort of thing. And ultimately, in most religions, not all, but you end up with a single god at the top and sometimes an only god. But it's a fairly consistent trend around the world how religions go from these very broad spiritual beliefs into monotheistic beliefs.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even something like in Greek, I'll call it mythology because we use that term, but we're really talking about the Greek pantheon of gods. Originally, there's a set of titans who give birth to all the ones who later become gods, including Zeus and Aphrodite and so forth. And when they first bring them forth, they're all kind of equal and they're all kind of struggling for positions of power. And as that evolved, Zeus takes on this sort of role of the primary god who has much more power than the other ones and can mess with their lives.
Exactly.
And so that's just a simple example of that evolution that you mentioned, that it really changed over time. And even though we have documentation of that whole pantheon of Greek gods, you can see that it started one way and it changed to something else as time went on.
That's right.
Which is really pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that's a great example because the idea that God is this ethereal thing is relatively new compared to all of that. Like back in the Christian times and prior to that, people thought that God was embodied in flesh, not a spirit. And that was one of the evolutionary trends, was to make gods less and less material and more ethereal.
Right. And even where in Christianity, we talk about Jesus as, the holy made flesh, as if that was an innovation. It's more like, we're just temporarily making a reversal of that trend.
That's right,
so that we can then make him ethereal again, which is kind of interesting. So a key thesis of your book is how religion evolves according to kind of the same principles as genetic or biological evolution, how it's a self-reinforcing system of self-replicating ideas. And I wondered if you could explain what you mean by a self-replicating idea.
Sure, that's one of the most fascinating topics. If you think of ideas, we all have ideas. There's the idea of democracy or the idea of what you're going to do for dinner, and some of these ideas are more interesting than others. But there's certain ideas that have a tendency to travel around through society. And in the book, I give the example of probably the stupidest joke ever. Why did the chicken cross the road, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you say, oh, that's a really stupid joke. But what's interesting about it is not that it's stupid or smart or anything else, but that all of us know it. Every single person in the United States probably knows that joke and knows the retort to it, and 100 other stupid retorts, right? And so the question is, why? Why is that joke so prevalent and so common and others are not? And if you go back to the principles of evolution, there's really three things that are important. You have something has to be able to replicate itself, to reproduce. It has to have natural filters, natural selection. And if you look at ideas, they do the same thing. That an idea, when I tell you a joke, it reproduces from my brain into your brain. And then if it's a good joke, that is, it's fit for survival, it will replicate into the next guy's brain because you'll tell it because you want to be the cool guy.
Yeah.
And they also, it's survival of the fittest, because the jokes that are better, they get told, and the jokes that are bad, they don't get told again. And there's also a filtering mechanism, which is that there's only a limited environment for jokes. Like, how many jokes do you actually know? We've probably heard in the neighborhood, I don't know, maybe 1,000, 10,000 jokes in our lifetime. At any given time, you might be able to come up with a couple. And under certain circumstances, you could probably, like something triggers your memory, you could probably tell 1,000 jokes or something like that. So there's a limited ecosphere, if you will, for jokes. And that's our brains and their ability to reproduce. And so it turns out that jokes are very much like biological life in that they have this Darwinian sort of principle that makes the good ones stick around and the bad ones die out. And they also have the property that they change. So if somebody tells a joke, I mean, you've all heard jokes in various forms, where somebody will tell it this way and somebody will tell it that way. And the better version of that joke gets passed along and the worst version doesn't until the joke gets pretty damn good.
Yeah.
So And it seems like a kind of a trivial idea about jokes, but it turns out there are huge numbers of our cultural structures that behave that way. And interestingly enough, I actually started thinking about this in terms of corporations. I was working at Hewlett-Packard at the time when Phil Hewlett and Dave Packard were still in charge, and they retired during my tenure there. And the company started to fall apart. And it became very much like when I say fall apart, what I mean is it became very much like all of the other companies in Silicon Valley. And they started, firing people instead of treating people like family. They started doing less, I don't want to say less ethical things, but it became ordinary, just like all the rest of them. And I thought, why does this always happen? And I happened to be at Stanford at the time studying the AI and linguistics and things like that. And I ran into Richard Dawkins' book. Now, he's probably about the most famous evolutionist in the world right now. And he wrote a book called The Selfish Gene. And in it, he first proposed the idea of self-replicating ideas. And he noted that they have the same ideas, the same properties as evolutionary biological life.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by that. And I started thinking, well, what about corporations, Because it turns out corporations have a personality very much like organisms, and they do things and have opinions that no single person in the corporation believes or does. And so they become these what's called an emergent property, where you have a system of individual things like an ant colony. And the ants all are very simple, but they have this emergent property that they do things that no individual ant knows how to do. And that's the way corporations are. And they evolve, and they're subject to evolution. So I started writing about that. And then I was looking at other things, and I latched onto religion. I said, now that's a pretty good memeplex there. It's been evolving for longer than anything else in human culture. So that was where it all came from. I got a little off your question, but...
No, but that leads perfectly into, something else I wanted to get clarity on, which is you use the term meme.
Yes.
And nowadays, of course, we usually use that term for phrases or images on the internet that get widely shared.
Right.
But that's not really the original meaning, and you've used it in the book by its original meaning, and I wonder if you could kind of explain that a little bit, and maybe we can even get into an example after you explain it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked, because when I wrote the book, which was around 2009, the term meme was only known by a few linguists and people like me who studied it. And it meant specifically any self-replicating idea that tended to propagate through society, or down through history or across society. So you take an idea like like any of the tenets of religion, that would be a meme. Or you could even say something like a tricky handshake, or a song that gets passed around, things that kids like to do. Those are all memes. Somebody comes up with an idea that gets passed around. Well, what happened was, on the internet, people started posting things and saying, oh, this idea went viral. And what they meant was they were referring to Richard Dawkins' concept of a meme, and the idea that these ideas can replicate in the same way viruses, in the meaning of viral replication, which means exponentially, so that it'll go from nothing to around the world in a very short time. And then they started posting these stupid images, like the classic cat images with a cat doing something stupid, and that was called a meme. And what's happened is that the internet has hijacked the word meme, which often happens in linguistics. So many of our words mean different things than when we first use them. Like the word awful, for example, used to mean full of awe, and now it means the exact opposite.
Right.
So words get hijacked. It happened to me, and unfortunately, I'd written an entire book about it. So there's a little disclaimer in the book about that, so that people will understand when they're reading it what I mean by the word meme.
Yeah, interesting. So in the book, you give several examples of religious memes, and one of the memes you describe is the one of intolerance of other religions.
Right.
And I wondered if you could read a part of the section on intolerance.
I'd be happy to. As a background for this, in the book, I point out that in pagan times, there was no real idea that somebody else's religion was wrong. They might be worshiping a god that you didn't think was, useful, but they were just a little bit misguided, maybe. And you might pray to their god if they went to their town, because that was the polite thing to do. But there was no idea of wrongness or any kind of error for praying to the wrong god. So that's the preface to this section. And so Ironically, even though the Jews were victims of persecution for their religion, it was the Jewish religion that became the cradle of religious intolerance. Prior to Antiochus and anti-Jewish edicts and the Maccabee revolt, the Jews had already laid the three cornerstones of religious intolerance. We've already examined them: the general purpose God meme, the monotheism meme, and Moses' covenant with Yahweh to make Yahweh the exclusive God of the Jews. In a nutshell, these three ideas taught that you could worship just one God, you should worship just one God, and that all other gods are false. That is, the Jews invented the idea that our religion is right and yours is wrong. The real birth of the intolerance meme is described in the book of Deuteronomy, probably written around 700 BCE, when it became forbidden and sinful to worship other gods. Prior to that, even though the Jews believed that they were Yahweh's chosen people and that Yahweh's protection depended on their fidelity to Yahweh, the Jews had no real issue with those who didn't follow their faith. Like the pagans, the Jews simply considered others to be misguided. But with Deuteronomy, the intolerance meme finally matured. Now, worship of other gods was considered a mortal affront to Yahweh and had to be suppressed. The genesis of the intolerance meme triggered one of the first great acts of religious genocide by the Jewish king Josiah around 622 BC from the Bible. In his 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, carved idols, and cast images. Under his direction, the altars of the Baals were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles, the idols, and the images. He burned the bones of the priests on their altars. He tore down the altars and the Asherah poles and crushed the idols to powder and cut to pieces all of the incense altars throughout Israel. From 2 Chronicles 34. It was a terrible tragedy in the history of humankind, but it was justified by the newly evolved intolerance meme.
Yeah. And interesting because we've seen that same type of scene play out historically since then many times of horrible brutality and even genocide in the name of our religion is right and yours is wrong.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how that has become a fixture at least in certain religions. And
yeah. Well, and if you look at what's going on right now, you also see a second aspect of that, like the Shia and the whole thing in Iran right now. You've got the two different branches of Islam, and the Sunni and the Shia, and it's largely a fight between those two groups. But in my opinion, the politicians are using that cynically for their own ends.
As they always do.
As they do, yeah. But the
and
people,
I think you're speaking of Iraq.
Iraq and Iran, yeah. They can get people to do their bidding because people believe this stuff.
Yeah. And we see that's what's going on with the Hindu nationalism in India right now. And
exactly.
We see it, and we've seen it many other times, during the Crusades. The first crusade was about wiping out the heretic Christians in Europe. It wasn't about, taking back the Holy Land. So,
yeah, well, and look what's happening in our own country right now, where you have the concept of intolerance is in broad display, isn't it? That some people think they're right because God told them so.
Right. Well, and if you've got a direct line,
That's right.
Perhaps you should let us know how to get it ourselves. If you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at KSQD, my guest is Craig James, and he is a local author, and he's got a new novel out. But right now we're talking about a book that he published a while ago, which is the book, The Religion Virus, Why We Believe in God. In reviewing the history of Christianity, you go into, a lot of great detail that I really found fascinating and appreciate, having studied a little of it myself. You go into some of the debates that had to be resolved, and the first council that Constantine commanded the bishops together for the Council of Nicaea in 325. That was, nominally 325 years after the birth of Christ. And at the Council of Nicaea, he essentially ordered all the gathered bishops to resolve their theological differences and reach consensus on some key theological questions. And in the book, you go over one of those main controversies that had to be resolved by the council, and wondered if you'd read the little section of that for us.
Yes, I'd be glad to. So this is the question of, was Joseph Jesus' father or not? The battle over adoptionism during the 2nd century AD is an example of competing memes responding to evolutionary pressure. The adoptionist meme says that Jesus was born human, not divine, and was later adopted by Yahweh as his son. Adoptionists believed that Joseph was Jesus' father and Mary was his mother, not a virgin, and that through Jesus' sinless devotion, God was very pleased and took Jesus as his own son, making him divine at Jesus' death. The anti-adoptionist meme is the now familiar, i.e. Orthodox, view that Jesus was born of a virgin and was divine from birth, and that Jesus and God are part of a single holy trilogy. The scribes of the 2nd century were educated men well aware of the debate that was raging about this question. Some of the Gospels they were copying contained phrases that supported the adoptionist beliefs. When Joseph and Mary took Jesus to the temple and the holy man Simon blessed Jesus, quote, his father and mother were marveling at what was said to him. Luke 2:33. The scribes changed this to Joseph and his mother. In several other places, Jesus' original, quote, parents were changed to Joseph and his mother. With the Council of Nicaea, the anti-adoptionist meme won the day. The subtle alterations of the gospel helped its case by changing the meme environment slightly in its favor. The adoptionist meme had several revivals throughout the centuries, but these were quickly suppressed by the anti-adoptionist meme, which by then was firmly entrenched in Christian orthodoxy. This is a perfect example of two memes that occupied the same ecological niche, and competed fiercely for survival. One meme won, the other is extinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to see how that changed, like they actually changed the language in the scripture in order to conform to that agreement.
Yeah.
Which was clearly, as you talked about governments taking advantage of religious situations, clearly the Roman Empire was trying to compel them to come up with a uniform standard, Christianity as it were, which was part of consolidating power. So,
an interesting side note to that, which I didn't know at the time I wrote that, was that in the Bible, if you go back to the original language of it, it does not say Mary was a virgin. The word that was used does not translate directly as virgin. It translates as a young woman or an unmarried woman, or more particularly, a woman who has not had a child yet. And if you take that out and then look at all the other stuff in the Bible that seems to imply she was a virgin, you can actually read it either way. And so, this is another case of the adoptionists, the anti-adoptionists won big time because they've suppressed that interpretation of the word itself.
Yeah. And it's interesting, of course, the scriptures that comprise the Bible were written, in Hebrew and Aramaic, and some were, written in Greek, but based on oral tradition that was probably in Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus spoke. So, all these translations, and then it gets translated to Latin, and then and so forth. Interestingly, there was a later council, the Council of Rome in 382, that established the biblical canon, that is the approved version, essentially. Before that time, there was no authoritative Christian Bible, just a bunch of different scriptures. And so we're seeing, kind of how that evolved itself, and just even looking at the Council of Nicaea, how certain passages were edited to suit the theology of the time.
That's right.
The approved theology. And ultimately, they ended up, leaving out certain scriptures and including certain. And yet today there are still different versions, all of which claim divine authority. So it's kind of an interesting job for the bishops to and cardinals to put all this together. And you mentioned, the whole idea of virgin, which brings me to another meme that's in Christianity that you call out, essentially the vilification of human sexual desire. I think both you and I can see some problems with this. But you describe how Tertullian of Carthage invented this concept of original sin, and then how St. Augustine took it into this direction of, sexual desire as being a bad thing. And I wondered if you'd care to read that passage for us.
Sure. Yeah, you gave a nice background for that. Augustine changed all of that. Anything pleasurable is a vice. The Christians instead declared that leisure, sloth, to be one of the 7 deadly sins. Or take lust. Christian theology teaches that chastity is the opposite of lust, and chastity is a virtue. This is the exact opposite of Aristotle's view, which is that both lust and chastity are bad, and that sex should be practiced with healthy moderation. The Christians' 7 deadly sins, lust, hunger, a desire for leisure, anger, envy, and pride, together pretty much sum up human nature. We all feel these things. By turning our natural instinctive emotions into sins, Christians achieved what the Jews and others had failed to achieve in 2,000 years. They made people feel bad for following their human nature. Augustine's philosophy of guilt was brilliant. Before Augustine, a decent moral person could live an exemplary life, never commit a crime, never hurt anyone, marry and raise a fine family, and at the end of life, be good in the graces of Yahweh for eternity. But Augustine ended that. Merely being good and moral isn't enough. You had to accept Christianity or face grave consequences. And one of the things I particularly like about this concept is it really illustrates the concept of evolution. That is, when things evolve, they evolve to be more survivable. And it doesn't necessarily matter if, in our judgmental view, those things are good or bad. So, we say human intelligence is a good trait and we evolve and are smart. But, so is a tapeworm. It's really good at what it does. And it evolved. That's evolution too. And when memes evolve, when religions evolve, they don't necessarily evolve in good directions that make people happy. They evolve in directions that make people want to believe it either because they like it or they fear it. So, the example of hell is directly related to Augustine's Augustine's concepts, that if you convince people that you don't believe these things, they're going to go to hell. They don't like that, but they want to believe it because the consequences are so dire. And so that idea, compared to, say, the Jewish idea of the afterlife, which is really very mild by comparison, and many others, it just doesn't have the same kind of marketing value. Or evolutionary value is really the correct way.
It doesn't motivate people quite as much.
And so these ideas, and if you look at these ideas over the years, Augustine was just another step in a long series of steps that made this stuff Christian doctrine. And at each generation, every 100 years, every 1,000 years, they got better and better into the memes that make up religion today. And that's one of the basic ones. And actually, most of those things are not in the Bible. Not in the way that people think they are.
Yeah, certainly, our vision of hell with a red-skinned, long-tailed, horned devil
it's just not there.
Is not in the Bible.
No.
That's wherever, that's sort of adopting, old pagan gods who weren't actually evil, but using that imagery, which is kind of an interesting one. Well, we're going to take a really short break. We'll be back with a lot more with Craig James after this, and we've got a lot more fun stuff to talk about, so stick around. So here we are, Talk of the Bay, and my guest is Craig James, and he's a local author, and among other things, he wrote a book titled The Religion Virus, Why We Believe in God, and I want to talk about that book a little bit more before we get into your new novel, which is a lot more fun, but perhaps not as, shall I say, relevant to current events, or maybe it is more relevant to current events. One of the things that I'm aware of is that today indigenous spiritual practices are making something of a comeback, or at least are getting more notice in the places where they've survived. Even there, though, whether it's Christian saints that are transposed upon pre-Christian nature deities in southern Mexico and Central America, or monotheism that's been integrated into the prayers and rituals of North American Plains tribes, the influence of Christianity is very evident. And you make an analogy between invasive species in ecology and invasive species in religion. And I wondered if you want to talk about that a little bit, and I think you even have perhaps a section in the book you might want to share.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. The analogy is to alien invading species. So if you look at what happened, the example I use in the book is that of Australia, when in the 1800s a fellow decided he liked to hunt rabbits, and so he imported some rabbits from England, and he let about 20 of them loose. And within about 20 years, they had just decimated the entire continent because, they breed like rabbits. And it's just astonishing how many rabbits you can have after just a few generations. And it got to the point where just 10 years later, they could kill 20 million rabbits a year and not even make a dent in the population. And the reason for this, you say, well, why didn't rabbits do that in England? And the reason is because as species evolve, predators and prey, they always evolve together as a unit. And so if you have rabbits and you take the predators that prey on them, let's say foxes or coyotes or whatever it happens to be in that region, imagine that you had a bunch of foxes that suddenly were much faster. So they could catch every rabbit. It sounded great for the foxes. They'd have a great old time. But pretty soon there wouldn't be any rabbits to eat. Right. And so the foxes would have out-evolved themselves and they would die. And conversely, if the rabbits got really fast, then all the foxes would starve and there'd be no predators. But then the rabbits would be at an actual disadvantage, the ones who were the fastest, because they have to eat more food to keep those big muscles and stuff. And so what happens is that we're seeing that right now. For example, the AIDS epidemic, the virus initially was very deadly and evolved very quickly, but now it's less deadly because the people who didn't die are the ones who spread it. Right. And you see that all
same true with COVID.
Yeah, COVID, the exact same thing. And epidemiologists predict this every time, and it doesn't always happen, but it usually does. And so if you look at religions, you take something like Christianity, which had really about 4,000 years to evolve before it started being spread by colonialism. But the real push for colonialism in the 18th century, when the colonialists, the Europeans arrived, they had this religion that had evolved for 4,000 years and had been competing with itself and with others. And it was like the rabbits that entered Australia, that it was extremely well evolved. It had been sharpened by this process, and it arrives in places where you have these indigenous groups who have fairly simple religions by comparison that have not evolved to have all the super likable, super infectious ideas, and Christianity just simply takes over whenever it encounters those kinds of religions. And of course it was helped by the technology and by being forced onto the natives, but in a way that, well, not in a way, as part of Christianity is proselytizing and pushing your religion on others. That was one of the memes that Christianity evolved, because if you look at, for example, the churches in America that are growing, it's the churches like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Assemblies of God that have active ministry campaigns. And the churches that are not growing are like the Roman Catholic Church and so forth that don't have active ministries. So the idea of pushing your religion on other people is part of those features of Christianity that evolved before it encountered all of these Aboriginal tribes of various sorts. It's very parallel to biological life in that regard, in that it's a real predator when it encounters more primitive religions.
Yeah, and I've witnessed it, being a fairly material process. Like I spent some time in Guatemala. This is many years ago, some 40 years ago now already. But at the time, you could see where the Church of Latter-day Saints would set up a church, and they'd build a new building, and they would provide a lot of amenities there for anybody who joined the church, so that if you joined that church in these little towns, in Guatemala, all of a sudden you had access to greater wealth and
Right.
greater supports. And, something as simple as, under Emperor Constantine, if you became a Christian when he's trying to do mass conversions, you pay lower taxes than other citizens of the Roman Empire.
Right.
Well, that's a pretty good reason to, so there's definitely all these factors converging. But obviously, to keep people within that, it also has to evolve on its own, by its own right, as you described.
That's right.
Yeah. One of the things I loved about the book is, you really go into a lot of really very precise detail, really historically, and in terms of discussing that sort of evolutionary structure of how things change. But you include interludes, and these interludes that you include are where you bring forward something about your own personal experience that shaped your perception. And I found one of these both very poignant and insightful. It's titled Shakespeare, Genesis, and the Big Bang. And I wondered if you'd read the first 5 paragraphs
I'd
of
be
that
happy
for
to.
us.
And it starts with a joke. Each section of the chapter, by the way, every chapter starts with a quote of some sort. And this, I have not been reading those, but this one does because it's one of my favorite little jokes. William Shakespeare didn't write all those plays. It was someone else with the same name.
Yeah. Right.
My youngest son's friend Dale, not his real name, has the strangest rationalization of the biblical Genesis that I've ever heard. Dale had the misfortune to be intelligent, inquisitive, and a fundamentalist Christian who believes the Bible is literally true. God, according to Dale, created the world 6,000 years ago. But Dale is smart and also realizes that the evidence plainly shows that Earth is over 4 billion years old and that evolution is real. These two beliefs are completely incompatible. So, according to Dale, for some inscrutable reason, God set everything up so that the universe looked exactly like it would if the Big Bang happened billions of years ago. Even though the stars are millions of light years away, God carefully placed photons headed for Earth so that it would look like the stars had been there all along. God carefully put fossils in the ground and carved out rivers and mountains and valleys, all so that it would appear that Earth is billions of years old. God created all the plants, animals, fungus, and other life forms exactly like they would have if they'd been evolving all along according to Darwin's theory of evolution. I was amazed to hear an otherwise rational, intelligent young man stretch so far to reconcile the facts about the world with his religious beliefs. The problem with his theory is that it's completely useless. I could just as well say that there are little green men living inside the sun and assert, correctly, that you can't prove me wrong. The little green men hypothesis isn't right or wrong. It is useless. It is uninformative, unpredictive, and doesn't explain anything. Dale's theory is not right or wrong. It's simply irrelevant. Dale claims God did this trick 6,000 years ago, but I could just as well claim that God created the world yesterday, and that we've only been on Earth for 24 hours, and that God implanted all of our memories so that we'd think we'd been here all our lives. Dale couldn't prove me wrong. It's a modern-day analog of solipsism, which is, very roughly speaking, asserts that we can't even prove that we exist at all, so all other argument is useless.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting one because if you believe that, then it kind of makes it gives God a character that I wouldn't call favorable. He's just gaming us, trying to scam us to test our faith, I guess.
And some people actually believe that.
Yeah, I know. And like, what kind of, if this is a merciful God, would they want to test your faith by creating a scenario where you can use your God-given senses to derive what is actually going on, but then have to realize that's all false because it's not what you're supposed to believe.
I wrote a blog once entitled, Did the Devil Write the Bible? And you're in court and you're arguing, and the lawyer points out that everything in the Bible is so confusing. If God wanted to tell us what to do, he'd just say so. Is homosexuality bad? It would say so really plainly. Was the earth created 6,000 years ago? It would say so really plainly. Instead the Bible's
contradictory.
It's got thousands of contradictions in it. And so my thesis was that the devil wrote it, and then he convinced us that God wrote it, because that's exactly what the devil would do.
Yeah, just play us for fools.
Play us for fools, yeah.
Yeah. Well, before we depart from the subject of religion, I had kind of a question popped into my mind because you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective. And according to a Pew Research Center survey, they do these surveys periodically about religion in the United States. About a quarter of U.S. adults, 27% in the last survey they did, now say they think of themselves as spiritual but not religious. And of course, that spirituality can take a lot of forms. But one thing they all have in common is some perception that there is something beyond the measurable material world, but they're not ascribing to a specific religious theology. So with that number growing, how do you see that fitting? I mean, is this a new step in the evolution of religion, at least in our country?
That's exactly right. I like to compare this to families that immigrate to the United States. So if you look at generational usage of languages like Spanish or German or French or whatever, when a family moves to the United States, the parents come and they speak their native language, and they often, but not always, learn to speak English. The children speak the language well. The grandchildren typically barely speak the language because they're not immersed in it in any way. And by the time you get to the great-grandchildren, nobody speaks the language unless they take it in school for whatever reason. And if you look at religion, one of the key factors in religion is that you have to learn it as a child. Because if you don't, if nobody exposes you to religion as a child and you grow up and people start telling you this stuff, you go, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. And so what happens with these spiritual people is that they are the second generation, that they have been exposed to it, they respect their parents, but they don't really believe what their parents believe, just as a second generation family doesn't speak Spanish or French or whatever. And by the time you get to the third and fourth generation, there's going to be nothing left.
Yeah, so here we are. We have evolved.
We have evolved.
Our religion has evolved. If you are just tuning in, I know it's near the end of the show, but if you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at K-Squid, my guest is Craig James, and he is a local author. And right now I want to switch gears and ask you, Craig, about your new novel that's about to hit the streets, Affairs of State. I have to say I read a lot of nonfiction, but I only read 1 or 2 novels a year. And I had a lot of fun reading Affairs of State.
Well, I'm glad to hear it.
I couldn't put it down.
Oh, good.
And I love how the novel begins with an argument between the president and the first lady. So how'd you get the idea for this novel?
Oh, gosh, it's so long ago. It's hard to remember how I got it. It was, I think well, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it was about the romance itself, like what would happen if sort of thing. It's just such an unlikely romance, and it's really hard to find a plausible way to make that happen, and to make it something that the reader doesn't go, oh, come on, And so that was the beginning of it. And of course, the main character, the protagonist in the story, his name is Owen. It's largely me. They say, write what you know. And of course, I'm a computer scientist. I worked all my life in doing databases and scientific programming and things like that. And the character is much like me. And so that part was easy. And, all of the other characters are based on people I know in one way or another. And you just sort of, I don't know, where does inspiration come from? It's hard to say, but I will say one thing though, a lot of it, I've written 2 novels now, and both of them have as their foundation current political events and misconceptions that people have in our society about what's really going on. And I wanted to bring some of that to light, and say, do you guys really see what's going on with our judicial system and the stacking of the courts and things like that? And so I crafted a story around that.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. And I love how different parts of your experience come in. Like you're a sailboat racer, and you actually have some not exactly racing, but trying to get away from a situation in a very fast carbon fiber trimaran. That's a really exciting scene in the book, and I really appreciated that you had the detail in there because you know how it's done.
And then I had to talk to my son-in-law, who is a lieutenant in the Navy, to make sure I got that end of it right.
Oh, great. Yeah. So you had the military protocols in there.
Yeah.
And in the novel, there's a lot of illegal and illicit activities. There's mysterious lobbyists who have a direct line to the president. There's, a website for anonymous sexual affairs with married people. There's hackers who make money by shorting options on companies that they've uncovered dirt on. They then expose to the media, and make a bunch of money that way. And then, of course, the biggest of all, which is a conspiracy that the president is involved in to assassinate. I won't give anything away here, but to assassinate somebody. But the hackers play a key role.
Yes.
In the novel. And I wondered if you could describe how they do their work.
Well, it's pretty scary when you learn how this stuff really works. We all know that there's hackers, and we hear about hacks all the time. Such and such got breached, like 23andMe was the latest, where they got all the data about Jewish people because people wanted to do their anti-Semitic thing, But basically the way it works is these computers that we have on our desktops and the phones we carry around in our pockets, they're so phenomenally complicated. I remember when I was first working in the computer industry, the first computer that I ever used was that I ever designed with as an electrical engineer. It was a 6800 computer by Motorola, and it was called such because it had 6800 transistors in it. And when the 68,000 came out, we were just astonished. And now they have billions and even trillions of transistors in a single chip. It's just astonishing how complicated these things are. And the amount of code that goes into them is equally astonishing. And so it's hardly surprising that there are vulnerabilities in all of this software. And on top of that, we don't, in most of our devices, like, you take a smart light bulb or the TV that's in your living room and stuff, the people who build those things, they're not security experts. And they often use these libraries that they buy from other people. And for example, there was the Internet of Things. There were only like 4 different libraries available for these developers, and all 4 of them were known to have holes in them. So you screw in a smart light bulb, and you've introduced a vulnerability into your house, that somebody can hack into. And it's a tiny little computer, but it's enough to get at the rest of your house.
Yeah.
And when you
once you hook it into your own internet.
Yeah. And when you take a corporate network, there's thousands of entry points and hundreds or thousands of devices. And so the idea that those can all be protected it just doesn't happen. And the hackers have these tools. There's these toolkits that they put together that contain every known exploit that's ever been found, and they wrap it up into a package, and they just do these brute force attacks. And there are all kinds of vehicles for doing these, whether it's, that you can plug in a charger and it starts broadcasting on your Wi-Fi network, or you can put it on a memory stick or whatever. All you have to do is get a foothold, and the game is over.
Yeah.
And then,
so how do these folks in the book, how do they use that to their advantage?
Well, they need, I don't want to spoil anything,
well,
but
right.
They need to get into a computer that ought to be pretty well protected. And because they think they're going to expose a little bit of philandering or maybe something like that. And what they find is just far, far worse than that. It's a conspiracy of a historic nature. So, yeah.
Yeah, and they're good at it. They've had practice because they're making money on.
They're making money doing it
as well. Yeah. Well, I really like how in the course of the book you switch voices. Like in chapters dealing with the president, what he's up to, it's told in third person, kind of that standard, narrative style of novels. But when Owen Richter, one of the principal characters, is in the scene, it's in first person from his perspective. And there's a nice exchange between Owen and his mother, who's a federal judge, in chapter 4. And I wondered if you'd read that for us.
I'd be glad to. Thank you. So they're in a restaurant. He's got some trouble in his life, and he just wants to have lunch with Mom and chat with her about it. The waitress appeared, another young woman in an inappropriately tight dress, this one soft black cotton. "Good afternoon, Judge," she exclaimed in a too cheery voice. "What can we get for you today?" Mom ordered light, a seafood appetizer, salad, and a glass of wine. I ordered my favorite, rockfish on Spanish rice with a Mexican-style vegetable sauce and a Diet Cola. As the waitress walked away, I couldn't help but comment on her attire. "That's quite a revealing dress. Do they only hire girls like that here?" Mom waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, who cares? That young, perfect body, let her enjoy flaunting it. It gets her tips from all these rich men. Maybe women, too. This is San Francisco, after all. I just hope she learns to take care of it so it'll last," she said. "Mom, that's terrible. Objectifying women? You're not supposed to say things like that anymore." "Oh, pish," she said. "I'm utterly proper on the bench, but I get to say what I think around friends and family. Objectify? Owen, humans are profoundly sexual creatures. Our lives revolve around sex. We can't help it. You know that. Anyone who says they don't objectify others is a liar. What matters is how we actually behave. If that girl came back, would you stare at her breasts and butt? Of course not, but yes, you would, honey, but you'd do it discreetly. She wears that sexy dress because she wants customers to look at her, but you'd treat her with respect even as you were objectifying her. I guess. But you couldn't help but notice she was an enticing young woman because you're a normal, healthy man. So tell me, what else do you know about her? Nothing. Nothing at all? Mom asked, raising her eyebrows. Uh-oh. I'd answered without thinking, and now Mom was going to call me on it. Mom, the judge, doesn't put up with intellectual laziness. Okay, well, I guess I know she works here. She's probably between 21 and 25. She's white. She exercises regularly. I ran out of things to say that I could be confident about. Right, you never had a conversation with her. You don't know if she's smart or not, rich or poor, well-educated or a dropout. You don't know her hobbies, her friends, her politics. You don't know if she's nice or mean. In fact, about the only thing you do know about her is that what she looks like and how she dresses. Everything you know about her is of a physical and sexual nature. If you claim you aren't objectifying her, you're fooling yourself or you're lying. I leaned back in my seat and shook my head with a little smile. One thing I learned long ago, don't argue with Mom unless you really know what you're talking about. And better yet, only argue if you've got your facts right and have worked out your logic ahead of time. Olivia Richter didn't get to be a federal judge by accident. As a public defender, she ripped up any district attorney who hadn't put a solid case together. When she switched sides, her conviction rate was the second highest in San Francisco. She would have been the top prosecutor except for the fact that she refused to push weak cases forward in which the police hadn't done their work. After a decade in the DA's office, she was appointed as a Superior Court judge. Then 5 years later, she was put on the California State Court of Appeals. Her appointment to the United States Federal District Court 4 years ago seemed to be the pinnacle of her stellar career. Just as I was contemplating whether to argue more, the object of our discussion returned, carrying our drinks. In spite of my efforts to smile and look the girl in the eye, she stopped on Mom's side of the table, which meant that to set my drink down, she had to lean over across the table, thereby giving me an impossible-to-ignore close-up of her cleavage and barely covered breasts. When she left, Mom could hardly contain her mirth. Now tell me you didn't objectify her, she teased. I yield to the court's expertise, Your Honor, I replied. But I know that if you met the woman outside here, you'd treat her with respect, listen to her views, and form a more complete picture of who she is, right? Mom, you know I have to answer yes to that. Well, it's true, Owen, because you're a kind, considerate man, and because I raised you right. That you did, Mom. I didn't get away with much.
That's great. Well, we have all of a minute left, and so I just want to give you a chance, Craig, to tell people how to find your books and say anything else you want to bring this conversation to a close. It's been great having you on the program.
Well, thank you for having me. You can find my website at authorcajames.com. That's authorcajames.com. And on the website, there you'll find links to my book, which you can purchase the novel starting February 15th on Amazon. And The Religion Virus has been for sale for quite some time, and you can find it there too.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you, and I hope to have you back when your next book is coming out.
Well, thank you. I'll be pleased to join you again.